In the dust-choked society of 1885, St. Joseph, Missouri, a woman's worth was measured by her name and her ability to produce an heir. For Jessie Mayfair, both were found wanting. Declared barren after a childhood fever, she became a whispered disgrace, a beautiful but empty vessel in a world that valued legacy above all else. So when the venomous matriarch of the town's most powerful family, Beatrice Carmichael, arranged a match for her, it was not an act of charity. It was a joke of exquisite cruelty, sending the infertile bride to a reclusive cowboy in the Wyoming wilderness, a man whose sole desire was a family to fill the vast, lonely plains. They waited for her to return, broken and shamed. They never imagined she would come back with a child in her arms and a story that would burn their world to the ground. St. Joseph, Missouri was a city of brick and ambition, the last gasp of civilization before the great untamed maw of the West. For Jessie Mayfair it was a gilded cage, and the bars were forged from whispers. The whispers had started when she was 16 after a brutal fever had swept through the city. The town physician, old Dr. Albright, a man whose hand smelled of whiskey and regret, had examined her, and declared with a sorrowful shake of his head that the illness had scorched the garden of her womb. From that day forward, she was no longer just Jessie. She was the barren Mayfair girl. Her father, a once proud merchant, now drowning in debt, saw her as a beautiful, unsellable commodity. Her suitors who had once flocked to her for her sharp wit and eyes the color of a summer sky now offered their condolences and their courtships to other, more fruitful prospects. She was 24, an old maid by the town's harsh standards, destined to be a spinster aunt, a creature of pity and quiet servitude. The architect of her public disgrace was Beatrice Carmichael, a woman whose face was a mask of powdered pleasantry, and whose heart was a cold, hard stone. Beatrice ruled St. Joseph society with an iron fist. Her son, Beau Carmichael, was the town's golden prince, handsome, charming, and utterly vapid. 2 years prior, Beau had attempted a clumsy, arrogant courtship of Jessie. Accustomed to women who fawned over him, he was stunned when Jessie had politely but firmly rebuffed his advances, finding him shallow and cruel. The insult festered in the Carmichael matriarch's soul. An offense to her son was an offense to her dynasty. She couldn't ruin Jessie's reputation. The whispers had already done that. But she could orchestrate a humiliation so profound it would be spoken of for generations. The opportunity came in the form of a letter passed to Beatrice by a business associate who operated a mail-order bride agency as a side venture. A man in Wyoming territory, a Mr. Wyatt Smith, was seeking a wife. The letter was short, blunt, and filled with a stark loneliness. He owned a ranch, he was solvent, and he desired a sturdy partner to build a family and a future. A cruel, brilliant idea sparked in Beatrice's mind. She would grant Jessie a way out. She would sponsor her as a mail-order bride. She summoned Jessie and her father to the Carmichael mansion, a monstrous house that loomed over the town like a vulture. "My dear Jessie," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "it pains me to see your prospects so limited. A woman of your refinement deserves a home, a husband." Jessie's spine stiffened. She knew this was no act of kindness. "What is it you are proposing, Mrs. Carmichael?" "I have arranged a match," Beatrice said, gesturing to the letter on her mahogany desk. "A rancher in Wyoming, a Mr. Smith. He is a man of property, seeking a wife to bear his children." She let the last words hang in the air, heavy and sharp as daggers. Jessie's father, smelling an escape from his daughter's financial burden, immediately began to stammer his gratitude. But Jessie saw the glint in Beatrice's eyes. This was a spectacle. They would send her, the barren woman, to a man who desperately wanted a family. They would pay her passage, buy her a new dress, and make a grand show of their charity. Then they would wait for the inevitable humiliating return. They would wait for the cowboy to discover the truth and send her packing a twice-shamed woman with nowhere left to turn. The joke was layered and vicious. Not only would Jessie be rejected, but the poor, unsuspecting cowboy would be a pawn in their cruel game. That night, Jessie lay awake, the weight of her life pressing down on her. She could stay in St. Joseph and wither under the constant rain of pity and scorn, or she could walk into the trap Beatrice had set. The West was a place of death and hardship, she knew, but it was also a place of reinvention. Out there under a sky bigger than she could imagine, maybe she wouldn't be the barren Mayfair girl. She would be just a woman, a flicker of defiance, a sentiment she had thought long dead ignited within her. She would go. She would face this unknown cowboy and this desolate land. She would survive. And in surviving, she would rob Beatrice Carmichael of her victory. She packed a single trunk with her meager belongings, a few practical dresses, her mother's Bible, and a small, worn book of poetry. As she boarded the train, she saw Beatrice and Beau Carmichael watching from their carriage, their faces smug with triumph. They smiled and waved the perfect picture of benevolent patrons. Jessie did not wave back. She simply met Beatrice's gaze, her expression unreadable, and then turned her face toward the setting sun, toward the vast, terrifying and promising emptiness of the West. The cage door was open. She was flying straight into the storm. The journey west was a relentless assault on the senses. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels became the heartbeat of her new life, each mile pulling her further from the suffocating civility of St. Joseph. The lush greens of Missouri bled into the endless sun-baked plains of Nebraska, and finally into the stark, majestic landscapes of Wyoming territory. The world grew larger, and she felt herself shrinking, a tiny, insignificant speck in a land governed by wind and stone. From the train, she took a jarring, bone-rattling stagecoach to the dusty outpost of Jericho Creek. It wasn't a town so much as a suggestion of one, a single muddy street flanked by a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of weathered, clapboard houses. It was here she was to meet Wyatt Smith. She stood on the wooden porch of the general store, her single trunk at her feet, feeling the curious stares of the few townsfolk who passed. They were a different breed from the people of St. Joseph. Their faces were weathered by the sun and wind, their eyes holding a mixture of weary pragmatism and fierce independence. Here a person's worth wasn't measured by their lineage, but by the calluses on their hands. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, a man on a dusty bay horse rode into town. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple canvas shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, dismounting in one fluid motion. He had a face that looked as if it were carved from the Wyoming landscape itself, strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the color of faded denim that seemed to miss nothing. His dark hair was shaggy, and a thick beard and mustache covered the lower half of his face, making him look older than the 30 years he'd claimed in his letter. He wasn't handsome in the polished, preening way of Beau Carmichael. He was formidable. He approached her, his steps slow and measured. "Miss Mayfair?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges from disuse. "Mr. Smith," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It is a pleasure to meet you." He simply nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her traveling dress, her pale face, her city-soft hands. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet assessment. He loaded her trunk onto a pack mule, tethered to his horse, helped her onto the horse's back, and then mounted behind her. The intimacy of it was startling. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, his arm a steady presence around her waist as he held the reins. They rode out of Jericho Creek in silence. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing between them. It wasn't the awkward, judgmental silence of a St. Joseph drawing room. It was the vast, natural silence of the plains. He seemed perfectly at home in it. Jessie, used to a life filled with chatter and noise, found it both unnerving and strangely peaceful. After 2 hours they crested a ridge and he finally spoke. "That's it," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Solitude's End." The name was apt. Nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek, with the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, standing sentinel in the distance, was a small, sturdy cabin. It was utterly isolated, a corral, a barn, and the cabin were the only signs of human life for as far as the eye could see. There was a raw, brutal beauty to the place that both terrified and captivated her. The cabin was rustic but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A handmade table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, and a small partitioned-off area served as the bedroom containing a single bed frame. He had built it all himself, she realized. The walls were solid, the roof was sound. It was a fortress against the wilderness. That first evening was a study in awkwardness. He prepared a simple meal of salt pork and beans, and they ate in their customary silence. Jessie felt the unspoken question hanging between them, the reason he had sent for her, the expectation she could never fulfill. She decided she could not live a lie. As he cleared their plates, she took a deep breath. "Mr. Smith." She began, her hands clenched in her lap. "There is something you must know. Something the agency and the woman who sponsored me failed to mention." He turned from the wash basin, his expression unreadable. "Wyatt," he corrected her gently. "My name is Wyatt." "Wyatt," she repeated. "When I was a girl, I had a terrible fever. The doctor said, he said it left me unable to have children." She watched his face braced for the anger, the disappointment, the cold dismissal. This was the moment the joke would land. This was when he would tell her to be ready for the next stagecoach back east. Wyatt stood there for a long moment, drying his hands on a rag. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and then he looked around the small, empty cabin. Finally, he met her eyes again. A flicker of something resignation, sadness crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The doctor said," he stated, his tone flat. He didn't know for certain. He was quite sure, she insisted, wanting the truth, however painful to be clear between them. Wyatt shrugged, a simple, powerful gesture. "This land is hard, Jessie. It takes more than it gives. A wife who can stand by my side, who isn't afraid of the silence and the work, that has a value all its own. We'll face what comes or what doesn't." He turned and banked the fire for the night. "The bed is yours," he said, his back to her. "I'll take my bedroll by the hearth." And that was it. No explosion of anger, no cruel words, just a quiet, stoic acceptance that was more shocking than any rage could have been. Jessie stood in the middle of the cabin, the silence now filled with a strange, burgeoning sense of hope. The cruelest joke ever devised had been told, and in the vast, lonely wilderness of Wyoming, its punchline had utterly failed to land. Life at Solitude's End was a rhythm of work dictated by the sun and the seasons. In St. Joseph, Jessie's days had been measured by social calls and embroidery. Here they were marked by the rising of bread, the mending of clothes, the tending of a small garden she carved out of the stubborn soil near the creek. It was hard, relentless work that left her muscles aching and her hands raw, but it was honest. For the first time in her life, she felt useful, her worth measured not by her womb, but by her resilience. Wyatt remained a man of few words, but Jessie began to learn his language. It was a language of action, not prose. Love wasn't spoken in sonnets. It was the way he'd silently leave a bucket of fresh well water by the cabin door each morning, so she wouldn't have to carry it. Respect wasn't in flowery compliments. It was in the sturdy axe handle he carved for her, perfectly sized for her grip, after seeing her struggle with the larger one. Concern wasn't in anxious questions. It was the extra blanket he'd leave on the foot of her bed when the nights grew colder. He taught her about the land not with lectures, but by showing her. He showed her which berries were safe to eat, how to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm, and how to track a deer. He taught her to shoot a rifle, not for sport, but for survival. She was a surprisingly good shot, her aim steady and true. The first time she brought down a rabbit for their stew, she saw a flicker of genuine pride in his eyes that warmed her more than any fire. In return, she brought a quiet softness to his harsh existence. She planted wildflowers around the cabin, their bright colors a defiant splash against the muted tones of the landscape. She read to him in the evenings from her book of poetry, her voice filling the silence that had been his only companion for so long. At first he seemed indifferent, but she would often catch him watching her, his expression thoughtful as she read. One evening after she finished a particularly poignant verse, he spoke into the quiet. "My mother used to read like that," he said, his voice thick with a memory he'd never shared before. The wall of his solitude, built brick by brick over years of loss and loneliness, was beginning to crumble. She learned in fragments about his past. His parents had been killed in a raid when he was a boy. He had built this ranch on their land, carving a life out of a place most people would have abandoned. He had sent for a bride, not just for heirs, but for companionship, to have another human voice in the vast emptiness. Their separate sleeping arrangements continued for months. There was a respectful distance between them, a shared understanding of their unconventional arrangement. But the space between his bedroll on the floor and her bed in the alcove began to feel charged with an unspoken tension. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the powerful grace in his movements, the quiet confidence with which he navigated his world. He was a good man, a man of profound integrity. The change came during the first autumn rains. A cold, miserable drizzle fell for 3 days straight, turning the world outside into a sea of mud. They were confined to the cabin, the space feeling smaller than ever. On the third night, the fire crackled, the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof, and the silence between them was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said. Jessie put down her mending and looked at him, truly looked at him, not as her husband by arrangement, but as the man who had shown her more kindness and respect than anyone in her life. "Wyatt," she said softly. He looked up from the harness he was oiling, his blue eyes catching the firelight. She didn't know what she intended to say, but no words were needed. She rose from her chair, walked the few steps to his bedroll by the hearth, and lay down beside him, pulling a corner of his blanket over her. He froze, his entire body going rigid with surprise. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, tentatively, he turned to face her. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the dim, flickering light of the fire, with the sound of the rain enclosing them in their own small world, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion and fury, but one of deep, aching loneliness, finally finding its solace. It was a kiss of gratitude, of partnership, of a shared future. That night, for the first time, Wyatt Smith did not sleep on the floor. He slept in the bed with his wife. And in the quiet intimacy of their union, they were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a piece of paper. They were a husband and a wife. They were a family, complete in their own way. The cruel joke from St. Joseph was a distant, faded memory, a ghost that had no power here in a small cabin where two lonely souls had found a home in each other. The first winter in Wyoming was a trial by ice and fury. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, turned a leaden grey, and the wind carried a bite that seemed to cut straight to the bone. Wyatt had prepared for it, reinforcing the barn, stocking the pantry, and chopping a mountain of firewood that stood taller than he was. He warned Jessie that a Wyoming blizzard wasn't just snow. It was a living, breathing monster that could swallow the world. In mid-January, the monster came. It started subtly with a stillness in the air, an eerie, heavy silence that made the livestock nervous. Then the sky began to shed small, hesitant flakes. Within an hour, the flakes had become a blinding, horizontal torrent, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. Wyatt had been out since dawn, checking on a section of his herd that had wandered further up the valley. He'd promised to be back by noon, but as the storm intensified, noon came and went. Jessie stood by the single window of the cabin, peering into the swirling white chaos, her heart a cold knot of fear in her chest. She couldn't see more than 10 feet from the door. The world had been erased. By late afternoon, she was beginning to panic. Wyatt knew this land better than anyone, but even the most experienced man could be caught unawares by a storm of this magnitude. She kept the fire roaring, a beacon of warmth and light against the raging tempest. The cabin groaned under the assault of the wind, and snow began to pile in deep drifts against the walls. As dusk fell turning, the white world outside into a terrifying, inky blackness, she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind, another trick of the storm's voice. But then it came again, faint and high-pitched, a sound that was horrifyingly out of place in the blizzard symphony. It was a cry, a human cry. She grabbed Wyatt's heavy buffalo coat from its peg, pulled on the boots he'd insisted she have, and tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end to the cabin's sturdy door handle. It was a fool's errand, she knew. To step outside was to risk being swallowed by the storm, lost forever, just feet from safety. But she couldn't ignore the sound. She opened the door and the storm lunged at her, a physical blow of wind and ice that stole her breath. Plowing through the snow, which was already up to her knees, she followed the sound, a desperate, wavering cry that was growing weaker. About 30 yards from the cabin, near a rocky outcrop that offered a sliver of shelter, she found them. A woman, barely more than a girl, was slumped against the rock, her clothes frozen stiff. Her face was blue with cold, her breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. And bundled in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a baby. The woman's eyes fluttered open as Jessie approached. They were wide with a mixture of terror and fierce maternal protectiveness. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile crackle. "My boy." "Thomas." "We have to get you to the cabin," Jessie shouted over the wind, trying to lift the woman. The woman shook her head, a small final gesture. Too late. For me. With a strength that seemed impossible, she pushed the bundled infant towards Jessie. "Take him. Please." Her hand went to a small silver locket around her neck. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the clasp. Give this to him. So he knows." Her voice trailed off, her eyes losing their focus. Her last breath was a white plume in the frigid air. and then she was still. Jessie stood frozen for a second, the wailing wind and the wailing baby the only sounds in the universe. She looked at the dead woman, a stranger who had died fighting to save her child, and then at the tiny red-faced infant in her arms. There was no time for grief or horror. There was only survival. Clutching the baby to her chest, she used the rope as her guide, pulling herself hand over hand back towards the faint, glowing square of the cabin window. Every step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. Finally, her hand hit the solid wood of the door and she stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor, the storm slamming the door shut behind her. She was soaked and half frozen, but her only thought was for the child. She unwrapped the bundle. It was a boy no more than a few days old, his skin frighteningly cold. She stripped off his wet wrappings and her own sodden coat, wrapping him in a dry blanket and holding him close to her own body, trying to warm him with her own life force. She warmed some milk on the stove, and using a strip of clean cloth as a makeshift teat, she managed to get a few precious drops into him. Slowly, miraculously, his crying subsided into weak whimpers, and his small body began to tremble with returning warmth. She had just settled him into a crate she'd lined with her softest wool shawl when the cabin door burst open again. It was Wyatt. He was covered in snow and ice, his face rimmed with frost. But he was alive. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his chest heaving. His exhausted eyes scanned the room, and then they fell on the makeshift cradle by the fire. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at Jessie, at her wet clothes and her pale, shocked face, and then back at the crate. He walked over slowly, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floor. He looked down at the sleeping infant, his tiny face peaceful in the firelight. He looked at the dead woman's silver locket, which Jessie had placed on the table. "Jessie," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. There was a woman. She choked out the story, tumbling out of her between sobs. In the storm, she gave him to me. Her name for him was Thomas. She died Wyatt. She died right out there. Wyatt didn't speak. He reached into the crate, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size and roughness, he lifted the sleeping baby into his arms. He held the infant against his chest, his large, calloused hand completely cradling the baby's head. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, and in the hardened, lonely eyes of Wyatt Smith, a rancher at the edge of the world, Jessie saw a look of profound, heart-stopping wonder. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the world was silent and still. The blizzard lasted for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the cabin with the storm's unexpected gift. The world outside was a formless, howling void, but within the sturdy log walls, a new world was being born. The awkward silence that had once defined their marriage was replaced by the demanding cries of an infant, the soft murmur of Jessie's lullabies, and the quiet, collaborative whispers of 2 people learning to be parents. Wyatt was transformed. The gruff, solitary man who communicated in shrugs and nods became a bastion of surprising tenderness. He would sit for hours by the fire, the baby Thomas sleeping soundly on his broad chest, his large hand gently patting the boy's back. He learned to change his swaddling, his movements clumsy at first, but growing more confident with each attempt. He would watch Jessie as she fed the baby, a look of quiet awe on his face. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon, his voice filled with a reverence she'd never heard before. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed, looking down at the tiny mouth latched onto the makeshift bottle. "I'm terrified I'll do something wrong." "You saved his life, Jessie," Wyatt said, his gaze unwavering. You walked out into that storm. That's not doing something wrong. That's everything right. In those 2 days, they became a team. When Thomas cried with colic, they took turns walking him across the cabin floor, their weary steps a shared dance of parenthood. They worked together without needing to speak, a seamless partnership forged in the crucible of the storm. The cabin, once a symbol of Wyatt's solitude, was now filled with life, with purpose, with a love that had arrived as suddenly and powerfully as the blizzard itself. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn in crystalline white sunlight, glittering on a landscape buried in feet of pristine snow. The first thing they did was bury the boy's mother. Wyatt built a simple wooden coffin, and they laid her to rest on a small hill overlooking the creek marking the grave, with a cross made from 2 sturdy branches. Standing over the grave with Jessie holding Thomas, Wyatt spoke. "We don't know your names, Mom," he said, his voice low and respectful. "But we thank you. We'll raise him right. He'll be a good man. You have my word." It was a vow, a promise, made not just to the dead woman, but to each other, and to the child who was now theirs. The question of what to do next was never spoken because there was no question. Thomas belonged with them. They took the silver locket the woman had given Jessie. It was a simple, elegant piece. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of the woman young, beautiful with sad, dark eyes. On the other side, where a man's portrait should have been, it was empty. There were no initials, no clues to her identity. It was a mystery with no solution. For now it was enough that it was Thomas's link to the mother who had given him life. News of the baby travelled as fast as gossip could in the sparsely populated territory. When Wyatt next rode into Jericho Creek for supplies with Thomas bundled securely in a sling on his chest, it caused a sensation. "Where in God's name did you get a baby Smith?" asked Hank, the portly owner of the general store. "Found him," Wyatt stated simply, his tone daring anyone to question it further. "A gift from the blizzard." The story spread, growing more mythic with each telling. The townsfolk, a practical and often harsh people, were captivated by it. They had all lost someone to the unforgiving wilderness. The idea of the land giving something back, of a life being saved instead of taken, was a powerful one. They called Thomas the Storm Child. The women of the town, who had once looked at Jessie with a mixture of curiosity and pity, now approached her with respect. They offered advice, homespun remedies for teething, and gifts of hand-knitted clothes. Jessie, the outcast from St. Joseph, had found her community. Wyatt registered the boy's birth with the circuit judge, listing the parents' names as Wyatt and Jessie Smith. The date of birth was an estimate. The place of birth was listed simply as Wind River Valley. He was their son. Legally, officially, and in every way that mattered, their life settled into a new, richer rhythm. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a home filled with the gurgles and cries of a child. Jessie's days were a blur of feeding, washing, and watching in wonder as Thomas grew. Wyatt worked his land with a renewed vigor, a man who was no longer just building a ranch, but a legacy. One evening, as Jessie watched Wyatt carve a small wooden horse for Thomas, her heart swelled with a feeling so profound, it almost hurt. This life, this man, this child, it was more than she had ever dared to dream of. She thought of Beatrice Carmichael and her cruel, pathetic joke. She had been sent to this wilderness to be broken. Instead, she had been found. She had been sent to a man who wanted a child she couldn't provide, and now, by a miracle of fate, they had a son. The punchline of the joke had been twisted into a blessing. The infertile bride had a child, and in doing so, she had found everything she had ever wanted. 2 years passed, The silence of solitude's end was now a memory replaced by the joyful noise of a toddler. Thomas, or Tom as they called him, was a whirlwind of energy. He had Wyatt's sturdy build and his mother's dark, soulful eyes. He was a child of the wilderness, unafraid of the vast spaces, his laughter echoing in the valley as he chased butterflies or followed his father to the barn. Wyatt and Jessie's partnership had deepened into a quiet, unshakable love. They were a unit, a family bound not by blood, but by a bond far stronger one forged in a storm and tempered by shared love for a child. The ghost of Jessie's past, the label of barren, had faded completely. Here she was simply a mother. One summer they travelled to Jericho Creek for the annual Founders' Day celebration. It was a rare trip for the whole family, a chance to see neighbours and replenish supplies for the coming months. Jessie dressed Tom in a small shirt she had sewn herself, and he looked every bit the proud rancher's son. As Wyatt negotiated with the blacksmith over the price of a new ploughshare, Jessie took Tom to the general store for a piece of candy. The town was bustling with unfamiliar faces, traders, travellers, and businessmen passing through on their way to the goldfields further north. One such man stood by the counter, a portly fellow in a sweat-stained suit and a derby hat, looking thoroughly out of place. He was complaining loudly about the quality of the local whiskey. His voice had a familiar nasal drawl that tugged at Jessie's memory. As she paid for Tom's candy, the boy reached up with a chubby hand and tugged at the silver locket that Jessie now wore around her own neck. She kept it safe for him, a link to the mother he would never know. The clasp came undone, and the locket fell open in her palm, revealing the miniature portrait of the beautiful, sad-eyed woman. "Well, I'll be," a voice drawled from beside her. Jessie looked up. The man in the derby hat was staring at the locket, his eyes wide with shock. A greasy smile spread across his face. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "My name is Edgar Schmidt. I couldn't help but notice that locket. And the boy, my goodness, he has the Carmichael eyes." Jessie's blood ran cold. The name hit her like a physical blow, a spectre from a life she had long since buried. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her voice tight as she quickly closed the locket. No mistake," Schmidt insisted, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "I'm a business associate of Mr. Beau Carmichael from St. Joseph, Missouri. I'd know that locket anywhere. Belonged to a little servant girl who worked for them. Caused quite the scandal, she did. Disappeared one night. And that boy? He's the spitting image of Beau's late grandfather." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Old Beatrice Carmichael has been turning over every stone looking for that girl and the babe. Seems the girl's grandmother left her a sizable inheritance, a trust that only passes to her blood kin. Beatrice doesn't care about the child, you understand. But the money, well, money is a different story." Jessie felt faint. She grabbed Tom's hand, her mind reeling. The dead woman in the snow, the sad eyes, the empty space in the locket where a man's portrait should be. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas's mother had been fleeing from Beau Carmichael, the man who had fathered and then abandoned her child. "You are mistaken," she repeated, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. She turned to leave, but Schmidt grabbed her arm. "Now hold on, Mom. Finding this boy could be very profitable, for both of us. A wire to St. Joseph. Mrs. Carmichael would pay handsomely for this information." At that moment, Wyatt walked into the store. He took in the scene in an instant, the terrified look on his wife's face, the strange man's hand on her arm, the boy hiding behind her legs. Wyatt's face, normally so calm and stoic, darkened into a thundercloud. He crossed the store in 3 long strides. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took Schmidt's wrist in his hand. Take your hand off my wife, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Schmidt yelped in pain as Wyatt's grip tightened his fingers like bands of steel. Easy now, friend. Just a misunderstanding. Wyatt squeezed harder, his eyes burning with cold fury. There is no misunderstanding. You will leave this store. You will get on the next stagecoach, heading east. And you will forget you ever saw me, my wife, or my son. Do you understand me? Schmidt, his face pale with fear, nodded frantically. Wyatt released him, and the man scrambled out of the store like a scalded cat. Wyatt turned to Jessie, his expression softening as he saw her distress. What was that about? Her voice was barely a whisper as she told him everything. The name, the inheritance, the truth behind the locket. Thomas was not just the son of a nameless woman who had perished in a storm. He was the illegitimate son of Beau Carmichael. He was the heir to a fortune. And a ghost from her past was now riding on the wind, carrying the news back east, back to the one person in the world who would stop at nothing to ruin her. They bought their supplies in silence and rode home, the joyful mood of the day shattered. The ranch, their sanctuary, suddenly felt vulnerable. That night, Wyatt sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and deadly. Jessie watched him, a new, terrible fear gripping her. The cruel joke of Beatrice Carmichael wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time they weren't just fighting for her honor. They were fighting for their son. 3 months later, they came. A fancy black-lacquered carriage, looking utterly alien against the dusty backdrop of Jericho Creek, pulled up in front of the town's only hotel. Out stepped Beatrice Carmichael, draped in black silk, as if in mourning for a life she hadn't yet destroyed. Behind her was her son Beau, looking older, softer, and more dissipated than Jessie remembered. They were followed by a man in a crisp suit, a lawyer from St. Louis, with a face like a clenched fist, and 2 hired men with guns on their hips and cruel, empty eyes. The news of their arrival reached Solitude's End before they did, carried by a concerned neighbor. Wyatt and Jessie had known this day was coming. They had spent the intervening months in a state of tense preparedness, Wyatt rarely straying far from the cabin, his rifle always close at hand. Beatrice did not come to the ranch. She was too clever for a direct confrontation in a place where Wyatt held every advantage. Instead, she sent the town sheriff with a court order. It was a document signed by a territorial judge hundreds of miles away, granting Beatrice Carmichael temporary guardianship of one Thomas Carmichael, pending a formal hearing to establish paternity and rightful custody. The hearing was to be held in 2 days in the Jericho Creek Saloon, the only building large enough to serve as a makeshift courtroom. The town buzzed with the news. The Carmichaels, with their money and their city lawyer, moved through Jericho Creek with an air of absolute certainty. They spread their story they were there to rescue their long-lost grandchild from the clutches of squatters who had stumbled upon him. They painted Jessie as a barren, desperate woman who had stolen a child to fill her empty life. The night before the hearing, Jessie couldn't sleep. She stood over Tom's small bed, watching his chest rise and fall in the moonlight. He was hers. She was the one who had warmed him, fed him, soothed his cries, and taught him his first words. Biology didn't make a mother. Love did. Wyatt came and stood beside her, his large hand resting on her shoulder. "We won't let them take him," he said, his voice a raw promise in the dark. "How can we fight them, Wyatt?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "They have money lawyers, a judge's order." "We have the truth," he answered simply. "And we're on our own land. That counts for something here." The day of the hearing, the saloon was packed. The entire town had turned out to witness the drama. On one side sat the Carmichaels, their lawyer and their hired guns. On the other sat Wyatt and Jessie, looking plain and rustic in their work clothes. They had no lawyer. They had only themselves. The circuit judge, a man named Patterson with a weary face and a reputation for being firm but fair, called the court to order. The Carmichaels' lawyer, Mr. Finch, was smooth and condescending. He presented his case with theatrical flair. He produced a sworn affidavit from Dr. Albright of St. Joseph, reaffirming Jessie's infertility. He called Edgar Schmidt to the stand, who recounted his story of recognizing the locket and the boy's resemblance to the Carmichael line. He painted a picture of a grieving, noble family seeking to reclaim their blood. This woman, Jessie Smith, Finch declared, pointing a finger at her, was known to be barren. Is it not a remarkable coincidence that a woman desperate for a child, she could never have just happened to find one in a blizzard, a child who, it turns out, is the sole heir to the considerable fortune of his maternal great-grandmother? This was not a rescue. It was an opportunistic kidnapping, the crowd murmured. The story as Finch told it was compelling. When it was Jessie's turn to speak, she walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding. She did not address the judge or the lawyer. She addressed the people of Jericho Creek. "I am not a kidnapper," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am a mother. The woman you see before you," she said, turning to look directly at Beatrice Carmichael, "sent me to this territory as a joke, because a doctor many years ago declared me barren. She sent me to a good man who wanted a family, expecting me to be rejected and sent home in shame. Her joke failed." She looked at Wyatt, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. 2 years ago, in the worst blizzard this valley has seen in a decade, I heard a cry. I tied a rope to my door and walked into that storm, not knowing if I would ever walk back. I found a dying woman. Her name I did not know, but I knew her love for her child. With her last breath, she gave me her son. She gave me this. Jessie held up the silver locket. Mr. Finch and Mrs. Carmichael would have you believe this is proof of their claim. And it is. But not in the way they think. She walked over to the judge's table and opened the locket. They speak of the portrait of Thomas's mother, but they neglect to mention the other side, the empty side where the portrait of a loving father should be. She turned and faced Beau Carmichael, who refused to meet her gaze. "Why is it empty, Mr. Carmichael? Is it because you gave this locket to a young woman you professed to love, but you were too much of a coward to put your own picture in it? Is it because you seduced a servant in your mother's house, and when she told you she was with child, you cast her out?" Beau's face turned white. Beatrice shot to her feet. "Lies, slander." "It is not slander." Jessie's voice rose, filled with a righteous fury. "There is more." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small, folded oilskin-wrapped paper. It was creased and worn. "This was tucked into the baby's blanket. I have kept it safe all this time. It is a letter." She began to read. The letter was from Thomas's mother, written to her unborn child. It spoke of her love for a man who had promised her the world, and then abandoned her, of his cruel mother, who had threatened her and forced her to flee. It named Beau Carmichael. It described his cowardice and her heartbreak, and it ended with a prayer that her child would grow up to be a better man than his father. A stunned silence fell over the saloon. Every eye was on the Carmichaels. Beau looked as if he was about to be sick. Beatrice's mask of cold composure had shattered her face, a contorted mess of fury and humiliation. Judge Patterson cleared his throat, his gaze like flint. "Mr. Carmichael, is this letter a forgery?" Beau couldn't speak. He just stared at the floor, the picture of guilt. The judge slammed his gavel down. This court recognizes that the boy may be the biological issue of Mr. Carmichael. However, it is abundantly clear that Mr. Carmichael abandoned both the mother and the child. Mrs. Smith risked her life to save this boy. Mr. and Mrs. Smith have provided him a loving and stable home. To remove him from the only parents he has ever known would be an act of profound cruelty. Custody is granted fully and permanently to Wyatt and Jessie Smith. The matter of the boy's inheritance will be placed in a trust managed by this court until he comes of age. Now get out of my town." Beatrice Carmichael let out a sound, somewhere between a screech and a sob. Her grand scheme, her final vicious joke, had not only failed, it had exploded in her face, exposing her family's rotten core for the entire world to see. Wyatt stood up and walked to Jessie's side, placing a protective arm around her. The people of Jericho Creek, who had been watching in silence, erupted in cheers. They surged forward, clapping Wyatt on the back and offering their support to Jessie. The Carmichaels, disgraced and defeated, were forced to retreat through a crowd of hostile, glaring faces. As they climbed back into their fancy carriage, Beatrice looked out the window and met Jessie's eyes one last time. There was no victory in Jessie's gaze, only a quiet, steely strength. The barren bride had not just come back with a child. She had come back with a family, a community, and a victory so complete it had ground the powerful Carmichael dynasty to dust. As the carriage rattled away, disappearing in a cloud of Wyoming dust, Wyatt pulled his wife and son close. The reckoning was over. They had won. They were home. And so the story of Jessie and Wyatt Smith became a legend in the high plains of Wyoming, a testament to the idea that family is not merely a matter of blood, but of heart, of courage, and of showing up when it counts. They raised Tom to be a man of integrity, a man who knew his value was in his character, not his name or his inheritance. The cruel joke that was meant to be Jessie's undoing became the foundation of her greatest joy. Her tale serves as a powerful reminder that the harshest wildernesses can sometimes forge the strongest souls, and that a life of worth is not something you are given, but something you build with your own 2 hands under a wide and open sky. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of resilience and frontier justice. If you were moved by Jessie's journey, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a great story, and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the heart of the American West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next video.